Ancient America, in Notes on American Archaeology, by John D. Baldwin. Part 8, American Ancient History. If a consecutive history of the ancient people of Central America and Mexico were ever written, it has been lost. Probably nothing of the kind ever was written in the manner which we call history, although there must have been regular annals of some kind. The ruins show that they had the art of writing, and that at the south this art was more developed, more like a phonetic system of writing, than that found in use among the Aztecs. The inscriptions of Palenque and the characters used in some of the manuscript books that have been preserved are not the same as the Mexican picture writing. It is known that books or manuscript writings were abundant among them in the ages previous to the Aztec period. They had an accurate measure of the solar year and a system of chronology, and many of their writings were historical. Among the Mayas, and in other communities of the same family, writing was largely used in the time of the Spaniards. It was common also among the Aztecs, but they used picture writing. Las Casas wrote on this point as follows: "It should be known that in all the commonwealths of these countries, in the kingdoms of New Spain and elsewhere, among other professions duly filled by suitable persons, was that of chronicler and historian. These chroniclers had knowledge of the origin of the kingdoms and of whatever related to religion and the gods, as well as to the founders of towns and cities. They recorded the history of kings and of the modes of their election and succession, of their labors, actions, wars, and memorable deeds, good and bad, of the virtuous men or heroes of former days, their great deeds, the wars they had waged, and how they had distinguished themselves, who had been the earliest settlers, what had been their ancient customs, their triumphs and defeats. They knew, in fact, whatever pertained to history, and were able to give an account of all past events. These chroniclers had likewise to calculate the days, months, and years, and though they had no writing like ours, they had their symbols and characters through which they understood everything, and they had great books which were composed with such ingenuity and art that our characters were really of no great assistance to them. Our priests have seen those books, and I myself have seen them likewise, though many were burned at the instigation of the monks, who were afraid they might impede the work of conversion. Books such as those here described by Las Casas must have contained important historical information. The older books belonging to the ages of Copan and Palenque went to decay doubtless long previous to his time, in the wars and revolutions of the Toltec period, or by the wear of time. The later books not otherwise lost were destroyed by Aztec and Spanish vandalism. According to tradition and the testimony of writing still in existence when the Spaniards went there, the Aztec or Mexican sovereign, Yitzhacotl, destroyed many of the old Toltec books. His aim was probably to exterminate among the people all memory of the previous times. Such things have been done with similar motives, as we know, in other countries by successful usurpers and conquerors. We learn from Spanish writers that a still greater destruction of the old books was effected by the more ignorant and fanciful of the Spanish priests who were established in the country as missionaries after the conquest. This is stated by Las Casas himself, one of the missionaries. Besides the many smaller bonfires of this fanaticism, there is a record of a great conflagration under the auspices of Bishop Zumarraga, in which a vast collection of these old writings was consumed. As the writing was all on paper, which had long been used in the country, the burning was easily accomplished. The old books, not all lost. The Franciscan and Dominican fanatics, whose learning and religion consisted of ignorance and bigotry, hoped to exterminate among the people all recollection of their former history, ideas, and religious customs. A few of the books, however, escaped, none indeed that were very old, for it does not appear that any of the manuscripts rescued from destruction were written or copied earlier than the age which closed the Aztec domination. None of the great books of annals described by Las Casas are among them, but they relate to an ancient time, and most of them are copies or reproductions of much older books. Among these destroying Spanish ecclesiastics, there was here and there one who quietly secured some of the manuscripts or copies of them. These were kept from the flames. Others were secreted by the people, and subsequently, in years after the conquest was completed, some of the more intelligent churchmen wrote histories of the country or portions of it, which were preserved in manuscript. Sahagun wrote such a history, which shows that he had studied the traditions in some of the old books. This work is printed in the great collection of Lord Kingsborough. Diego de Landa, first bishop of Yucatan, wrote a history of the Mayas and their country, which was preserved in manuscript at Madrid in the library of the Royal Academy of History. It is one of the most important works on the country written by a Spaniard because it contains a description and explanation of the phonetic alphabet of the Mayas. Landa's manuscript seemed to have lain neglected in the library, for little or nothing was heard of it until it was discovered and studied by Brasseur de Bowerberg, who, by means of it, has deciphered some of the old American writings. He says, "The alphabet and signs explained by Landa have been to me a Rosetta Stone." Figure 49 represents a specimen of the inscriptions as carved upon the stone. Figure 50 gives them as they appear in manuscript. An extensive and important manuscript work written 200 years ago by Francisco Jimenez, an ecclesiastic, is preserved in Guatemala. He, being drawn to the inquiries concerning the antiquities and ancient history of the country, was able to get possession of several of the old books, one of them being known as Popol Vuh. His manuscript, arranged in 4 great volumes, one of which, it is said, has disappeared, contains valuable information in regard to the ancient history and traditions of Guatemala. One of the volumes has a copy of the Popol Vuh in the native tongue, and another has a Spanish translation of the work. He left also a manuscript dictionary of the principal Guatemalan dialects, which belonged to the Maya family, entitled Tesoro de Laguas Quiche, Cacchiquel y Tzutohil. Probably other manuscripts of the same character exist at Madrid and in Central America, which are not yet known to those who can understand their importance. As already stated, none of the great books of annals have been discovered, but some of the old American manuscripts, now preserved in several of the libraries and private collections of Europe, are important. 3 are specified as particularly valuable to students of American antiquity. That called the Codex Chimalpopoca, an old Toltec book written in the Toltec language, one now entitled the Codex Cacchiquel and the Popol Vuh. The latter, written in the Quiche dialect, was translated into Spanish 200 years ago by Jimenez, but his translation remained in Guatemala unprinted and quite unknown until it was discovered in our time. Brasseur de Bowerberg, who is a master of the Quiche language, and to whom we are indebted for most that is known of the manuscripts of Jimenez, though this Spanish translation very imperfect, therefore he has translated the work into French. The Popol Vuh was written in 1558 as an abridged reproduction of a very ancient Quiche book, which contained an account of the history, traditions, religion, and cosmogony of the Quiches. The first part of it is devoted to the cosmogony and traditional lore. The rest gives an account of the Quiches, who, at the time of the conquest, were the dominant people in the Central American regions south of the Great Forest. If the history were consecutive and clear, it would not take us back into the past more than 3 or 4 centuries beyond 1558, for the Quiche domination was probably not much older than that of the Aztecs. But the history is not clear. Putting aside the mythical and legendary portion of it, which relates to origins and migrations, we can see that it extends over some 14 centuries, which may indicate that Quiche became an independent and ruling power about 1200 AD. For those who study the book, it is full of interest. It shows us their conceptions of the Supreme Being and his relation to the world. It enables us to see what they admired in character as virtue, heroism, nobleness, and beauty. It discloses their mythology and their notions of religious worship. In a word, it bears witness to the fact that the various families of mankind are all of one blood, so far, at least, as to be precisely alike in nature. The cosmogony and mythical lore of the Quiche seem to have their root in the beliefs and facts of a time far more ancient than the national beginning of this people. In assuming the form in which we find them, they must have passed through several phases of growth, which changed their appearance and obscured their meaning. Manifestly, the history of the country did not begin with the Quiches. The account of the creation, with everything else in this cosmogony and mythology, is original, like the civilization to which they belong. According to the Popol Vuh, the world had a beginning. There was a time when it did not exist. Only heaven existed, below which all space was an empty, silent, unchanging solitude. Nothing existed there, neither man nor animal nor earth or tree. Then appeared a vast expanse of water on which divine beings moved in brightness. They said, "Earth," and instantly earth was created. It came into being like a vapor. Mountains rose above the waters like lobsters and were made. Thus was the earth created by the heart of heaven. Next came the creation of animals, but the gods were disappointed because the animals could neither tell their names nor worship the heart of heaven. Therefore it was resolved that man should be created. First, man was made of earth, but his flesh had no cohesion. He was inert, could not turn his head, and had no mind, although he could speak. Therefore he was consumed in the water. Next, men were made of wood, and these multiplied, but they had neither heart nor intellect and could not worship, so they withered up and disappeared in the waters. A third attempt followed. Man was made of a tree called tsite, and woman of the pith of a reed. But these failed to think, speak, or worship, and were destroyed, all save a remnant which still exists as a race of small monkeys found in forests. A fourth attempt to create the human race was successful, but the circumstances attending this creation are veiled in mystery. It took place before the beginning of dawn, when neither sun nor moon had risen, and was a wonder work of the heart of heaven. 4 men were created, and they could reason, speak, and see in such a manner as to know all things at once. They worshipped the Creator with thanks for existence, but the gods, dismayed and scarred, breathed clouds on their eyes to limit their vision, and cause them to be men and not gods. Afterward, while the 4 men were asleep, the gods made for them beautiful wives, and from these came all the tribes and families of the earth. No account of the rescued fragments of this old literature of ancient America should omit giving due credit to Chevalier Botturini, the Milanese who went from Italy to America in 1735 as an agent of the Countess Santibane, who claimed to be a descendant of Montezuma. He, too, was a devotee and believed that St. Thomas preached the gospel in America, but he had antiquarian tastes and was sufficiently intelligent to understand the importance of the old manuscripts which had furnished so much fuel for the bonfires of fanaticism. During the 8 years of his residence in Mexico and Central America, he hunted diligently for those in existence and made a considerable collection, including in it some of the Mexican picture writings. But when about to leave, he was despoiled of his treasure and flung into prison by the Spanish viceroy. He finally left the country with a portion of them, but was captured by an English cruiser and again despoiled. The manuscripts left in Mexico were finally sold at auction while Humboldt was there. He secured a portion of them. Another portion was brought to France about 1830 by M. Aubin, who made important additions to it. M. Aubin himself spent years searching for remains of the old writings, and he has now, it is supposed, the most valuable collection in Europe. It is likely that most of the recovered books may be translated by those who can bring to the work habits of patient study and a thorough knowledge of the native dialects. Dictionaries of these dialects, as they were spoken at the time of the conquest, were prepared by some of the Spanish priests, and other facilities are not wanting. It is surprising, however, that no one has translated the Codex Chimalpopoca, which seems the most important, if the language in which it is written is in fact sufficiently modern to be managed as easily as that of Popol Vuh. It must be translatable, for its general tenor is known and passages of it are quoted. Brasseur de Bowerberg states that he has undertaken a translation. But who will translate the inscriptions at Copan and Palenque? Is the language in which they were written an old form of speech from which the dialects of the Maya family or a portion of them were derived? They have not been translated. No one has found a clue to their meaning. The characters are understood, but they appear to show an older form of the language which at present cannot be deciphered. Brasseur de Bowerberg's Rosetta Stone, discovered in Landa's manuscript, will not serve him here. Another more potent must be found before these old inscriptions can be made to give up their secrets. The Ancient History Sketched. It is impossible to know what was contained in the books of annals written by the official chroniclers of these ancient American countries, for these books are lost. They existed at the time of the conquest. Some of them were seen and described by Las Casas, but so far as is known, not one of these books of regular annals, such as he described, has escaped destruction. Therefore, it is impossible to know anything certain of their character as histories. The books preserved furnish little more than vague outlines of the past, with obscure views of distinct periods of the history created by successive dominations of different peoples or different branches of the same people. What they enable us to know of the old history resembles what is known of the early times of the Greeks, who had no ancient history except such as were furnished by their poets of the cycle. In one case, we are told of the Pelasgians, Leleges, Cadmeans, Argives, and Aeolians. Very much, as in the other, we are told of the Calhuas, Chichimecs, Quinames, and Nahuas. But the outline is not wholly dark. It does not exclude the possibility of a reasonable attempt at hypothesis. When Cortez entered Mexico, the Aztecs, Montezuma's people, had been in power more than 2 centuries. Most of the ancient history of which something is said in these books relates to ages previous to their time, and chiefly to their predecessors, the Toltecs. According to these writings, the country where the ruins are found was occupied by successive periods by 3 distinct people: the Chichimecs, the Calhuas, and the Toltecs, or Nahuas. The Toltecs are said to have come into the country about 1,000 years before the Christian era. Their supremacy appears to have ceased and left the country broken up into small states 2 or 3 centuries before the Aztecs appeared. They were preceded by the Calhuas, by whom this old civilization was originated and developed. The most ancient people, those found in the country by the Calhuas, are called Chichimecs. They are described as a barbarous people who lived by hunting and fishing and had neither towns nor agriculture. This term, Chichimecs, appears to have been a generic appellation for all uncivilized aborigines. Brasseur de Bowerberg says, under the generic name Chichimecs, which has much embarrassed some writers, the Mexican traditions include the whole aboriginal population of the New World, and especially the people by whom it was first occupied at the beginning of time. Some of the traditions state that the Calhuas came from the east in ships. Sahagan mentions that a tradition to this effect was current in Yucatan. The precise value of these traditional reports is uncertain, but if accepted as vague historical recollections, they could be explained by supposing the civilized people called Calhuas came from South America through the Caribbean Sea and landed in Yucatan and Tabasco, They are uniformly described as the people who first established civilization and built great cities. They taught the Chichimecs to cook their food, cultivate the earth, and adopt the ways of civilized life, and the Chichimecs, civilized by their influence, are sometimes called Quinames. The Calhuas are connected with vague references to a long and important period in the history previous to the Toltec ages. They seem to have been, in some respects, more advanced in civilization than the Toltecs. What is said of events in their history relates chiefly to their great city called Xibalba, the capital of an important kingdom to which this name was given. The Toltecs, in alliance with the uncivilized Chichimecs of the mountains, subjugated this city and kingdom, and thus brought to a close the period which may be termed Calhuan. This kingdom appears to have included Guatemala, Yucatan, Tabasco, Tehuantepec, Chiapas, Honduras, and other districts in Central America, and it may have included all southern Mexico, for places north of the Tampico River are mentioned as being within its limits when the Toltecs came into the country. Some of the principal seats of the Calhuan civilization were in the region now covered by the Great Forest. Some investigators have sought to identify the city of Xibalba with the ruined city known to us as Palenque. Brasseur de Bowerberg says Palenque appears to have been the same city to which the books give the name of Xibalba, but this is nothing but conjecture. We may as reasonably suppose Copan, Quirigua, or some other old ruin to have been Xibalba. Those who attempt to believe this old American civilization was brought across the Atlantic by the Phoenicians in very remote times assume, against the plain testimony of the monuments, that the Calhuas came to America from some country on the Mediterranean. They may have come from some other part of this continent. In my judgment, it is not improbable that they came by sea from South America. Brasseur de Bowerberg would say that they were people of the Atlantic race who, having escaped destruction by the cataclysm, found their way to Yucatan and Tabasco. But there is little besides conjecture to support any theory of their origin. We have only the fact that, according to the old books and traditions of the country, they occupied the region at a remote period and originated the civilization whose monuments are found there. Tradition places their first settlements on the Gulf Coast in Tabasco, between Tehuantepec and Yucatan. It is inferred that the Mayas, Tsendals, Quiches, and some other communities of the old race were descendants of the Calhuas, their speech being more highly developed than that of any native community not connected with this family, and their written characters having a close resemblance to those of the oldest inscriptions. The Toltecs, our mound builders. As the remains of the mound builders show clearly that they had commercial intercourse with the Mexican and Central American countries, and as it seems probable that they had otherwise a very close relation to the people of those countries, it would be surprising to find no mention of their country in the old books and traditions of the Central Americans and Mexicans. If we could have the lost books, especially those of the more ancient time, and learn to read them, it might be possible to know something of the origin and history of the mound builders. It is believed that distinct reference to their country has been found in the books still in existence, and there appears to be reason for this belief. Brasseur de Bowerberg, one of the few investigators who have explored them, says, "Previous to the history of the Toltec domination in Mexico, we notice in the annals of the country two facts of great importance, but equally obscure in their details. First, the tradition concerning the landing of a foreign race, conducted by an illustrious personage who came from an eastern country. And second, the existence of an ancient empire known as Huhu-Tlapalan, from which the Toltecs or Nahuas came to Mexico, in consequence of a revolution or invasion, and from which they had a long and toilsome migration to the Aztec Plateau. He believes that Huihui-Tlapalan was the country of the mound builders in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. According to the native books he has examined, it was somewhere at a distance in the northeast, and it is constantly said that some of the Toltecs came by land and some by sea. Sahagun learned from the old books and traditions and stated in the introduction to the first book of his history that the Toltecs came from the distant northeastern country, and he mentions a company that came by sea, settled near the Tampico River, and built a town called Panuco. Brasseur de Bowerberg finds that an account of this or another company was preserved at Tzelanco, an ancient city situated on the point of an island between Lake Terminos and the sea, and famous for its commerce, wealth, and intelligence. The company described in this account came from the northeast in the same way, it is said, to the Tampico River and landed at Panuco. It consisted of 20 chiefs and a numerous company of people. Torquemada found a record which describes them as people of fine appearance. They went forward into the country and were well received. He says they were industrious, orderly, and intelligent, and that they worked metals and were skillful artists and lapidaries. All the accounts say the Toltecs came at different times, by land and sea, mostly in small companies, and always from the northeast. This can be explained only by supposing they came by sea from the mouth of the Mississippi River or from the Gulf Coast near it, and by land through Texas. But the country from which they came was invariably Huehuetlapan. Cabrera says Huehuetlapan was the ancient country of the Toltecs. Its simple name was Tlapalan, but they called it Huhu, old, to distinguish it from the 3 other Tlapalans, which they founded in the districts of their new kingdom. Torquemada says the same. We are not authorized to reject a fact so distinctly stated and so constantly reported in the old books. The most we can do against it with any show of reason is to receive it with doubt. Therefore, it seems not improbable that the old Tlapalan of Central American tradition was the country of our mound builders. Another circumstance mentioned is not without significance. It is said in connection with this account of the Toltec migration that Huehuetlapan was successfully invaded by Chichimecs, meaning barbarous aboriginal tribes who were united under one great leader. Here is one statement, a little condensed, touching this point. There was a terrible struggle, but after about 13 years, the Toltecs, no longer able to resist successfully, were obliged to abandon their country to escape complete subjugation. 2 chiefs guided the march of the emigrating nation. At length, they reached a region near the sea named Tlapalan Canco, where they remained several years. But they finally undertook another migration and reached Mexico, where they built a town called Tolanzingo, and later the city called Tulan, which became the seat of their government. This is substantially what is told of the defeat and migrations of the Toltecs. The history of Itztlilchoquitl adds doubtful modifications and particulars not found in the Codex Chimalpopoca. See Quatre Lettres, etc. This Chichimec invasion of Huehuetlapan is placed at a period which, in the chronology of the native books, was long previous to the Christian era, and is mentioned to explain the beginning of the Toltec movement towards Mexico, but the account of it is obscure. To find a system of chronology in these old books is not surprising when we consider that even the Aztecs of Montezuma's time knew enough of astronomy to have a correct measure of the year. The Aztecs adopted the methods of astronomy and chronology which were used by their predecessors. They divided the year into 18 months of 20 days each, but as this gives the year only 360 days, 5 supplementary days were added to each year and a 6th day to every 4th year. The bisextile is known to have been used by the Mayas, Tzendals, and Quiches, and it was probably common. We cannot reasonably refuse to give some attention to their chronology, even while doubting its value as a means of fixing dates and measuring historical periods. Its method was to count by equal periods of years as we count by centuries, and their chronology presents a series of periods which carries back their history to a very remote time in the past. Brasseur de Bowerberg says, "In the histories written in the Nahuatl language, the oldest certain date is 955 years before Christ. This," he means, "is the oldest date in the history of the Nahuatl or Toltecs which has been accurately determined. The calculation by which it is found is quoted from the later portion of the Codex Chimalpopoca as follows: 6 times 400 years plus 113 years, previous to the year 1558 AD. This is given as the date of a division of the land by the Nahuatls. The division was made 2,513 years previous to 1558 AD, or in 955 BC. If this date could be accepted as authentic, it would follow that the Nahuatls or Toltecs left Huhuhtlapalan more than 1,000 years previous to the Christian era, for they dwelt a long time in the country of Xibalba as peaceable settlers before they organized the civil war which raised them to power." Some confirmation of this history. That the ancient history of the country was something like what is reported in the old writings seems not improbable when we consider the condition in which the native population was found 350 years ago. This shows that Mexico and Central America had been subjected to disrupting political changes caused by violent transfers of supreme influence from one people to another several times in the course of a long history. Such a history is indicated by the monuments, and its traces were noticeable in peculiarities of the native inhabitants of the various districts at the time of the Spanish conquest. They are still manifest to travelers who study the existing representatives of the old race and the old dialects sufficiently to find them. There were several distinct families or groups of language, and in many cases the people represented by each family of dialects were in a state of separation or disruption. To a considerable extent they existed in fragmentary communities, sometimes widely separated. The most important group of related dialects was that which included the speech of the Mayas, Quiches, and Sendals, which, it is supposed, represented the language of the original civilizers, the Calhuas. Dialects of this family are found on both sides of the Great Forest. There were other dialects supposed to indicate Toltec communities, and there were communities south of Mexico in Nicaragua, and even farther south, which used the Aztec speech. Very likely all these differing groups of language came originally from the same source and really represent a single race, but comparative philology has not yet reported on them. Mention is made of another people called Waiknas or Caribs, and conjecture sees in them remains of the aboriginal barbarians termed Chichimecs. They dwelt chiefly in the dense, dank forests found growing on the low alluvion of the Atlantic coast. So far as is known, their speech had no affinity with that of any other native community. People of this race constitute a chief element in the mixed population of the Mosquito Coast, known as Mascas. In Yucatan, the old inhabitants were Mayas, and the people using dialects related to theirs were numerous in Tabasco, Chiapas, Guatemala, and the neighboring districts, while all around the country were scattered communities supposed to be of the Toltec origin, as their speech could not be classed with these dialects nor with that of the Aztecs. The most reasonable explanation of this condition of the people is that furnished by the old chronicles and traditions. The country must have been occupied during successive periods by different peoples, who are represented by these broken communities and unlike groups of language. When all the native writings still in existence have been translated, and especially when the multitude of inscriptions found in the ruins shall have been deciphered, we may be able to see in a clearer light the ruins, the people, and their history. 9. The Aztec Civilization. If a clever gleaner of the curious and notable things in literature should write on the curiosities of historical speculation, he would be sure to take some account of A New History of the Conquest of Mexico, published in Philadelphia in 1859. The special aim of this work is to deny utterly the civilization of the Aztecs. The author has ability, earnestness, and knowledge of what has been written on the subject. He writes with vigor and with a charming extravagance of dogmatic assumption, which must be liked for its hardiness while it fails to convince those who study it. This writer fully admits the significance of the old ruins and maintains that a great civilization formerly existed in that part of the continent. This he ascribes to the Phoenicians, while he gives it an extreme antiquity and thinks the present ruins have existed as ruins for thousands of years, explaining these words to mean that their history is separated by a cycle of thousands of years from the civilization of our day. In his view, the people who constructed the old cities were subjugated and destroyed long ages since by inroads of northern savages, who were the only people in the country when the Spaniards arrived. The chief business of this new history is to set forth these views. Under the treatment of its author, Montezuma becomes a rude Indian sachem, his kingdom a confederation of barbarous Indian tribes like that of the Iroquois, the city of Mexico a cluster of mud huts or wigwams in an everglade, its causeways rude Indian footpaths, its temples and palaces pure fictions of lying Spanish romance, and all previous histories of the Aztecs and their country extravagant inventions with a Moorish coloring. He would have us believe that what he calls the pretended civilization of Montezuma and his Aztecs was a monstrous fable of the Spaniards, a pure fabrication, encouraged by the civil authority in Spain and supported by the censorship of the Inquisition. Therefore, he undertakes to destroy the fabric of lies, unveil those Mexican savages, the Aztecs, and tell a new story of their actual character and condition. Of course, views so preposterous do not find much favor. If the Mexicans had been nothing more than this, the experience of Cortes among them would have been like that of De Soto in his long and disastrous march through Florida, the Gulf regions, and the country on the lower Mississippi. Cortes and his men had a different fortune, because their march was among people who had towns, cities, settlement communities, and the appliances and accumulations of civilized life. Doubtless some of the Spaniards exaggerated and romanced for effect in Spain, but they did not invent either the city of Mexico or the kingdom of Montezuma. We can see clearly that the Mexicans were a civilized people, that Montezuma's city of Mexico was larger than the present city, and that an important empire was substantially conquered when the city was finally subjugated and destroyed. That the ancient city of Mexico was a great city, well built partly of timber and partly of cut stone, laid in a mortar of lime, appears in all that is said of the siege and of the dealings of Cortes with its people and their rulers. Montezuma, wishing to remove false notions of the Spaniards concerning his wealth, said to Cortes during their first interview, "The Tlascalans, I know, have told you that I am like a god, and that all about me is gold, silver, and precious stones, but you now see that I am mere flesh and blood, and that my houses are built of lime, stone, and timber." Lime, stone, and timber. This was the poorest view of the old city of Mexico that could be given to those who saw it. It is not easy to understand how a denial of the Aztec civilization was possible. The discovery and invasion. The first inhabitants of that part of the continent seen by the Spaniards were Mayas from Yucatan. Columbus met them in 1502 at an island near Ruatan, off the coast of Honduras. While he was stopping at this island, these Mayas came there in a vessel of considerable size from a port in Yucatan, 30 leagues distant. It was a trading vessel, freighted with a variety of merchandise, and it used sails. Its cargo consisted of a variety of textile fabrics of diverse colors, wearing apparel, arms, household furniture, and cacao, and the crew numbered 20 men. Columbus, who treated them very kindly, described these strangers as well-clothed, intelligent, and altogether superior to any other people he had discovered in America. Adventurers hunting for prey soon began to make voyages in that direction and report what they saw. Sailing along the coast of Yucatan, they discovered cities, and the grandeur of the buildings filled them with astonishment. On the mainland and on one or two islands, they saw great edifices built of stone. The seeming riches and other attractions of the country led the Spaniards to invade Yucatan, but they were defeated and driven off. At this time, they gained considerable knowledge of Mexico and persuaded themselves that immense wealth could be found there. Finally, in March 1519, Cortes landed near the place where Vera Cruz was afterward built and moved on through the country towards the city of Mexico. Studying in all the histories of the conquest only their incidental references to the civilized condition of the people, we can see plainly what it was. As the invaders approached Tlaxcala, they found beautiful, whitewashed houses scattered over the country. The Tlaxcalans had towns, cities, agriculture, and markets. Cortes found among them all that was needed by his troops. His supremacy in Tlaxcala was easily established, and it was not difficult to induce the people to aid him cordially in his operations against Mexico, for they hated the Aztecs, by whom they had recently been subjugated. In a description of their capital, he stated that it was as large as the city of Granada in Spain. He went next to Cholula, where, near the Great Mound, was an important city in which they saw a great plaza. Bernal Diaz said of this city, "I well remember, when we first entered this town and looked up to the elevated white temples, how the whole place put us completely in mind of Valladolid. The white temples were elevated because they stood on high pyramidal foundations, just as they are seen in the old ruins. It is probable, however, that these were built of adobe bricks or of timber. The city very likely was much older than the Aztec Empire." A Spanish officer named Ordaz ascended Mount Popocatépetl, and one thing he saw was the Valley of Mexico, with its city, its lagunas and islands, and its scattered hamlets, a busy throng of life being everywhere visible. The City of Mexico. At the City of Mexico, Cortes had a great reception, negotiation having established the form of friendly relations between him and Montezuma. Quarters were provided in the city for the Spanish portion of his army, a vast edifice being set apart for their use, which furnished ample accommodations for the whole force. The place could be entered only by causeways. They marched on a wide avenue which led through the heart of the city, beholding the size, architecture, and beauty of the Aztec capital with astonishment. This avenue was lined with some of the finest houses, built of a porous red stone dug from quarries in the neighborhood. The people gathered in crowds on the streets, on the flat roofs, in the doorways, and at the windows to witness the arrival of the Spaniards. Most of the streets were narrow and had houses of a much less imposing character. The great streets went over numerous canals, on well-built bridges. Montezuma's palace was a low, irregular pile of stone structures extending over a large space of ground. Among the teocallis of the Aztec capital, the great temple stood foremost. It was situated in the center of a vast enclosure which was surrounded by a heavy wall 8 feet high, built of prepared stone. This enclosure was entered by 4 gateways opening on the 4 principal streets of the city. The temple was a solid structure built of earth and pebbles and faced from top to bottom with hewn stone laid in mortar. It had 5 stages, each receding so as to be smaller than that below it. In general outline, it was a rectangular pyramid 300 feet square at the base, with a level summit of considerable extent, on which were 2 towers and 2 altars where perpetual fires were maintained. Here the religious ceremonies were conducted. The ascent was by a circular flight of steps on the outside, which went 4 times around the structure, the water in the lagoons being salt. The city was supplied with water by means of an aqueduct, which extended to Chapultepec. Such substantially is the account given of the old city of Mexico and its great temple by every writer who saw them before the conquest, and all the struggles which took place for possession of this capital had a character that would have been impossible anywhere save in a large city. In every account of the attacks on the great temple, we can see that it was a great temple. And we may perceive what the old city was by reading any account of the desperate and bloody battles in which the Spaniards were driven from it after standing a 10 days' siege in the great stone building they occupied. The Conquest. This battle took place in the latter part of June 1520, several months after the friendly reception, and was occasioned by the treacherous and most atrocious proceedings of the Spaniards, which drove the Mexicans to madness. Nearly a year passed before Cortés made another attack on the Mexican capital. During this time, he found means among the Tlascalans to build a flotilla of 13 vessels, which were transported in pieces to Lake Texcoco, and they were put together. This would have been impossible if he had not found in the country suitable tools and mechanics. By means of these vessels, armed with cannon and assisted by a great army of native allies consisting of Tlascalans, Cholulans, and many others, he took control of the lagunas, secured possession of the causeways, and attacked the city in vain for 45 days, although his men several times penetrated to the great square. He now resolved to enter by gradual advances and destroy everything as he went. This he did, burning what was combustible and tearing down most of the edifices built of stone. Nevertheless, 30 or 40 days more passed before his work of destruction was complete. The inhabitants of the city were given over to extermination. The conquerors proceeded immediately to rebuild the city, native architects chiefly being employed to do the work. Materials for the rebuilding were taken from the ruins. Probably many of the old Aztec foundations were retained, and there may now be edifices in the city of Mexico which stand on some of these foundations. 12 acres of the great enclosure of the Aztec temple were taken for a Spanish plaza and are still used for this purpose, while the site of the temple is occupied by a cathedral. The plaza is paved with marble. Like the rest of the great enclosure, it was paved when the Spaniards first saw it, and the paving was so perfect and so smooth that their horses were liable to slip and fall when they attempted to ride over it. Some relics recovered from ruins of the old temple have been preserved. Among them is the great Aztec calendar which belonged to it, on which are carved hieroglyphics representing the months of the year. This calendar was found in 1790, buried in the great square. It was carved from a mass of porous basalt and made 11 feet 8 inches in diameter. It was a fixture of the Aztec temple. It is now walled into one side of the cathedral. The stone of sacrifice, another relic of the temple, 9 feet in diameter and covered with sculptured hieroglyphics, can still be seen in the city, and in the suburbs, it is said, vestiges of the ruins of long lines of edifices can be traced. Calendars made of gold and silver were common in Mexico. Before Cortés reached the capital, Montezuma sent him 2 as large as cartwheels, one representing the sun and the other the moon, both richly carved. During the sack of the city, a calendar of gold was found by a soldier in a pond of Guatemozin's garden. But these Spaniards did not go to Mexico to study Aztec astronomy, nor to collect curiosities. In their hands, every article of gold was speedily transformed into coin. In every Spanish description of the city, we can see its resemblance to cities whose ruins are found farther south. If the Spaniards had invented the temple, they would not have made it unlike anything they had ever before seen or heard of by placing its altar on the summit of a high pyramid. This method of constructing temples is seen in the old ruins, but it was unknown to Cortés and his men until they found it in Mexico. The only reasonable or possible explanation of what they had said of it is that the temple actually existed in the Aztec capital and that the Spaniards being there described what they saw. The uniform testimony of all who saw the country at that time shows that the edifices of towns and cities, wherever they went, were most commonly built of cut stone, laid in mortar, or of timber, and that the more rural districts, thatch was frequently used for the roofs of dwellings. Moreover, we are told repeatedly that the Spaniards employed Mexican masons and found them very expert in the arts of building and plastering. There is no good reason to doubt that the civilized condition of the country, when the Spaniards found it, was superior to what it has been at any time since the conquest. Who were the Aztecs? The Mexicans, or Aztecs, subjugated by Cortés, were themselves invaders, whose extended dominion was probably less than 250 years old, although they had been much longer in the Valley of Mexico. There were important portions of the country, especially at the south, to which their rule had not been extended. In several districts, besides those of the Mayas and the Quiches, the natives still maintained independent governments. The Aztec conquest of the central region between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific was completed only a few years previous to the arrival of the Spaniards, and the conquest of this region had not been fully secured at some points, as appeared in the readiness of the Tlascalans and others to act in alliance with Cortés. But the Aztecs did not come from abroad. They belonged in the country and seem to have been originally an obscure and somewhat rude branch of the native race. It is very probable that the Cahuas or Nahuas or Toltecs of the old books and traditions, together with the Aztecs, were all substantially the same people. They established in the country 3 distinct family groups of language. It is said, but the actual significance of this difference in speech has not been clearly determined. These unlike groups of languages have not been sufficiently analyzed and studied to justify us in assuming that they did not all come from the same original source, or that there is a more radical difference between them than between the Slavonic, Teutonic, and Scandinavian groups in Europe. These ancient Americans were distinct from each other at the time of the conquest, but not so distinct as to show much difference in their religious ideas, their mythology, their ceremonies of worship, their methods of building, or in the general character of their civilization. If the Toltecs and our mound builders were the same people, they probably went from Mexico and Central America to the valley of the Mississippi at a very remote period, as Calhouan colonies, and after a long residence there they returned so much changed in speech and in other respects as to seem a distinct people. The Aztecs appear to have dwelt obscurely in the south before they rose to power. They must have been at first much less advanced in civilization than their predecessors, but ready to adopt the superior knowledge and methods of the country they invaded. They came from the south. It has sometimes been assumed that the Aztecs came to Mexico from the north, but there is nothing to warrant this assumption, nothing to make it probable, nothing even to explain the fact that some persons have entertained it. People of the ancient Mexican and Central American race are not found farther north than New Mexico and Arizona, where they are known as Pueblos or village Indians. In the old times, that was a frontier region, and the Pueblos seem to represent ancient settlers who went there from the south. There was the borderline between the Mexican race and the wild Indians, and the distinction between the Pueblos and the savage tribes is every way so uniform and so great that it is well nigh impossible to believe they all belong to the same race. In fact, no people really like our wild Indians of North America have ever been found in Mexico, Central America, or South America. Investigation has made it probable that the Mexicans or Aztecs went to the Valley of Mexico from the south. Mr. Squire says, the hypothesis of a migration from Nicaragua and Cuscatlan to Anahuac is altogether more consistent with probabilities and with tradition than that which derives the Mexicans from the north, and it is a significant fact that in the map of their migrations presented by Gemelli, the place of the origin of the Aztecs is designated by the sign of water, ATL standing for Aztlan, a pyramidal temple with grades, and near these a palm tree. Humboldt thought this indicated a southern origin. Communities of Aztecs still exist as far south as Nicaragua and Costa Rica, with some variations in their speech, but not so great, probably, as to make them unintelligible to each other. The Spanish historian Oviedo called attention to the fact that an isolated community of Aztecs was found occupying the territory between Lake Nicaragua and the Pacific. They were called Niquirans, and Mr. Squire seemed to have verified this fact. The result of his investigation is that the people of the district specified are Aztecs, and that, from the comparative lateness of the separation or some other cause, their distinguishing features were easily recognized, their speech being nearly identical with the native speech heard in the Valley of Mexico. Oviedo said of them, the Niquirans who speak the Mexican language have the same manners and appearance as the people of New Spain, or Mexico. In the neighboring districts, communities closely related to the Mayas are found, and others that appear to belong to the Toltec family. Aztecs are found still farther south, and there appear to be conclusive reasons for believing that Montezuma's people went from the south to Anahuac, or Mexico. According to the native histories as reported by Clavigero, the Aztecs began their migration northward from Aztlan about the year 1160 A.D., and founded the more important of their first settlements in the Valley of Mexico about the year 1216 A.D., a little over 300 years previous to the Spanish invasion. Another result of investigation adds a century to this estimate. This result is reached as follows. The Mexicans stated constantly that their calendar was reformed sometime after they left Aztlan, and that in the year 1519, 8 cycles of 52 years each and 13 years of a 9th cycle had passed since that reform was made. This carries back the beginning of their migration considerably beyond the year 1090 AD. Their sway seems to have been confined for a long time to Anahuac. They grew to supremacy in part, probably by the arrival of new immigrants, but chiefly by conquest of the small states into which the country was divided. They could learn from their more cultivated neighbors to reform their calendar, compute time with a greater accuracy, and make important improvements in other respects. They must also have modified their religious system to some extent, for it does not appear that they had adopted the worship of Kukulkan, whose name they transformed into Quetzalcoatl, before they came to Mexico. But they brought with them an effective political organization, and very likely they were better fitted than most of their new neighbors for the rude work of war. Before the city of Mexico was built, the seat of their government was at Tezcuco. The character of their civilization after they rose to preeminence was shown in their organization, in their skill as builders, in the varied forms of their industry, and in the development of their religious ceremonies. It is manifest that they adopted all the astronomical knowledge and appliances found in the neighboring states which they subjugated. Their measure of the solar year and their numbering of the months were precisely like what had long existed in this part of the country, and they had the same astronomical implements or contrivances. One of these contrivances found at Chapultepec is described as follows. On the horizontal plane of a large, carefully worked stone, 3 arrows were cut in relief, so that the shaft ends came together and made equal angles in the center. The points were directed eastward. the two outside showing the two solstial points, and that in the center, the equinoctial. A line on the carved band holding them together was in range with holes in two stones which stood exactly north and south. A cord drawn tightly through the holes in these two stones would, at the moment of noon, cast its shadow on the line drawn across the band. It was a perfect instrument for ascertaining east and west with precision and for determining the exact time by the rising and setting of the sun at the equinoxes and solstices. This stone has now been broken up and used to construct a furnace. These Aztecs were manifestly something very different from Mexican savages. At the same time, they were less advanced in many things than their predecessors. Their skill in architecture and architectural ornamentation did not enable them to build such cities as Mitla and Palenque, and their picture writing was a much ruder form of the graphic art than the phonetic system of the Mayas and Quiches. It does not appear that they ever went so far in literary improvement as to adopt this simpler and more complete system for any purpose whatever. If the country had never in the previous ages felt the influence of a higher culture than that of the Aztecs, it would not have now, and never could have had, ruined cities like Mitla, Copan, and Palenque. Not only was the system of writing shown by the countless inscriptions quite beyond the attainments of Aztec art, but also the abundant sculptures and whole system of decoration found in the old ruins. 10. Ancient Peru. The ruins of ancient Peru are found chiefly on the elevated tablelands of the Andes between Quito and Lake Titicaca, but they can be traced 500 miles farther south to Chile, and throughout the region connecting these high plateaus with the Pacific coast. The great district to which they belong extends north and south about 2,000 miles. When the marauding Spaniards arrived in the country, this whole region was the seat of a populous and prosperous empire, complete in its civil organization, supported by an efficient system of industry, and presenting a very notable development of some of the more important arts of civilized life. These ruins differ from those in Mexico and Central America. No inscriptions are found in Peru. There is no longer a marvelous abundance of decorations. Nothing is seen like the monoliths of Copan or the bas-reliefs of Palenque. The method of building is different. The Peruvian temples were not high truncated pyramids, and the great edifices were not erected on pyramidal foundations. The Peruvian ruins show us the remains of cities, temples, palaces, other edifices of various kinds, fortresses, aqueducts, one of them 450 miles long, great roads extending through the whole length of the empire, and terraces on the sides of mountains. For all these constructions, the builders used cut stone laid in mortar or cement, and their work was done admirably. But it is everywhere seen that the masonry, although sometimes ornamented, was generally plain in style and always massive. The antiquities in this region have not been as much explored and described as those north of the isthmus, but their general character is known, and particular descriptions of some of them have been published. The Spanish Hunt for Peru. The Spanish conquest of Peru furnishes one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of audacious villainy. It was the work of successful buccaneers as unscrupulous as any crew of pirates that ever robbed and murdered on the ocean. After their settlements began on the islands and the Atlantic coast, rumors came to them of a wonderful country somewhere at a distance in the west. They knew nothing of another ocean between them and the Indies. The western side of the continent was a veiled land of mystery, but the rumors constantly repeated assured them that there was a country in that unknown region where gold was more abundant than iron among themselves. Their strongest passions were moved: greed for the precious metals and thirst for adventures. Balboa was hunting for Peru when he discovered the Pacific about 1511 AD. He was guided across the isthmus by a young native chief who told him of that ocean, saying it was the best way to the country where all the common household utensils were made of gold. At the Bay of Panama, Balboa heard more of Peru and went down the coast to find it, but did not go south much beyond the 8th degree of north latitude. In his company of adventurers at this time was Francisco Pizarro, by whom Peru was found, subjugated, robbed, and ruined some 15 or 20 years later. Balboa was superseded by Pedrarius, another greedy adventurer whose jealousy arrested his operations and finally put him to death. The town of Panama was founded in 1519 by this Pedrarius, chiefly as a point on the Pacific from which he could seek and attack Peru. Under his direction in 1522, the search was attempted by Pascual de Andagoya, but he failed to get down the coast beyond the limit of Balboa's exploration. Meanwhile, clearer and more abundant reports of the rich and marvelous nation to be found somewhere below that point were circulated among the Spaniards, and their eagerness to reach it became intense. In 1524, 3 men could have been seen in Panama busily engaged preparing another expedition to go in search of the Golden Country. These were Francisco Pizarro, a bold and capable adventurer who could neither read nor write; Diego de Almagro, an impulsive, passionate, reckless soldier of fortune; and Hernando de Luque, a Spanish ecclesiastic, vicar of Panama, and a man well acquainted with the world and skilled in reading character, acting at this time, it is said, for another person who kept out of view. They had formed an alliance to discover and rob Peru. Luque would furnish most of the funds and wait in Panama for the others to do the work. Pizarro would be commander-in-chief. The vessels used would necessarily be such as could be built at Panama and therefore not very efficient. Pizarro went down the coast, landing from time to time to explore and rob villages until he reached about the 4th degree of north latitude, when he was obliged to return for supplies and repairs. It became necessary to reconstruct the contract and allow Pedrarius an interest in it. On the next voyage, one of the vessels went half a degree south of the equator and encountered a vessel like a European caravel, which was, in fact, a Peruvian balsa, loaded with merchandise, vases, mirrors of burnished silver, and curious fabrics of cotton and woolen. It became again indispensable to send back to Panama for supplies and repairs, and Pizarro was doomed to wait for them 7 months on an island. He next visited Tumbes in Peru and went to the 9th degree of south latitude, but he was obliged to visit Spain to get necessary aid before he could attempt anything more, and it was not until the year 1531 that the conquest of Peru was actually undertaken. In 1531, Pizarro finally entered Tumbes with his buccaneers and marched into the country, sending word to the Inca that he came to aid him against his enemies. There had been a civil war in the country, which had been divided by the great Inca Huayna Capac, the conqueror of Quito, between his 2 sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, and Huáscar had been defeated and thrown into prison and finally put to death. At a city called Caxamalca, Pizarro contrived by means of the most atrocious treachery to seize the Inca and massacre some 10,000 of the principal Peruvians who came to his camp unarmed on a friendly visit. This threw the whole empire into confusion and made the conquest easy. The Inca filled a room with gold as the price of his ransom. The Spaniards took the gold, broke their promise, and put him to death. The ruins near Lake Titicaca. It is now agreed that the Peruvian antiquities represent 2 distinct periods in the ancient history of the country, one being much older than the other. Mr. Prescott accepts and repeats the opinion that there existed in the country a race advanced in civilization before the time of the Incas, and that the ruins on the shores of Lake Titicaca are older than the reign of the first Inca. In the work of Rivero and Vanchuti, it is said that a critical examination of the monuments indicates two very different epochs in Peruvian art, at least so far as concerns architecture, one before and the other after the arrival of the first Inca. Among the ruins which belong to the older civilization are those at Lake Titicaca, Old Huánuco, Tihuanaco, and Gran Chimu, and it probably originated the roads and aqueducts. At Cuzco and other places are remains of buildings which represent the later time, but Cuzco of the Incas appears to have occupied the site of a ruined city of the older period. Figure 51 gives a view of the ancient Peruvian masonry. Montesinos supposes the name of Cuzco was derived from cosca, a Peruvian word signifying to level, or from heaps of earth called cascos, which abounded there. In his account of the previous times there is mentioned that the old city built there was in ruins. Perhaps the first Inca found on its site nothing but cascos, or heaps of ruins. At Lake Titicaca, some of the more important remains are on the islands. On Titicaca Island are the ruins of a great edifice described as a palace or temple. Remains of other structures exist, but their ruins are old, much older than the time of the Incas. Figures 52 and 53 represent different ruins on the island of Titicaca. They were all built of hewn stone and had doors and windows with posts, sills, and thresholds of stone, the doorways being narrower above than below. On the island of Coati, there are remarkable ruins. The largest building here is also described as a palace or temple, although it may have been something else. It was not high, but very large in extent. It stood around three sides of a parallelogram, with some peculiarities of construction connected with the ends or wings. Making allowance for the absence of the pyramidal foundations, it has more resemblance to some of the great constructions in Central America than to anything peculiar to the later period of Peruvian architecture. Another ruin on this island is shown in Figure 54. The antiquities on the islands and shores of this lake need to be more completely explored and described, and probably interesting discoveries could be made at some points by means of well-directed excavations. A few miles from Lake Titicaca at Tihuanaco are ruins which are very imposing when first seen by the Spaniards in the time of Pizarro. It is usual to speak of them as the oldest ruins in Peru, which may or may not be correct. They must, however, be classed with those at the lake. Not much now remains of the edifices which were in a very ruinous condition 340 years ago. They were described by Cieca de Leon, who accompanied Pizarro, and also by Diego de Alcobaça. Cieca de Leon mentions great edifices that were in ruins, an artificial hill raised on groundwork of stone, and two stone idols resembling the human figure and apparently made by skillful artificers. These idols were great statues 10 or 12 feet high. One of them, which was carried to La Paz in 1842, measured 3.5 yards in length. Sculptured decorations appear on them, and according to Cieca de Leon, the figures seem to be clothed in long vestments different from those worn in the time of the Incas. Of a very remarkable edifice, whose foundations could be traced near these statues, nothing remained then but a well-built wall which must have been there for ages, the stones being very much worn and crumbled. Cieca de Leon's description goes on as follows. In this place, also, there are stones so large and so overgrown that our wonder is incited, it being incomprehensible how the power of man could have placed them where we see them. They are variously wrought, and some of them, having the form of men, must have been idols. Near the walls are many caves and excavations under the earth, but in another place, farther west, are other and greater monuments, such as large gateways, with hinges, platforms, and porches, each made of a single stone. It surprised me to see these enormous gateways made of great masses of stone, some of which were 30 feet long, 15 high, and 6 thick. Many of the stone monuments at Tiwanaku have been removed, some for building, some for other purposes. In one case, large masses of sculptured stone, 10 yards in length and 6 in width, were used to make grinding stones for a chocolate mill. The principal monuments now seen on this field of ruins are a vast mound covering several acres, where there seems to have been a great edifice, fragments of columns, erect slabs of stone which formed parts of buildings, and several of the monolithic gateways, the largest of which was made of a single stone 10 feet high and 13 broad. Figure 55 gives a view of one. The doorway is 6 feet 4 inches high and 3 feet 2 inches wide. Above it, along the whole length of the stone, which is now broken, is a cornice covered with sculptured figures. The whole neighborhood, says Mr. Squire, is strewn with immense blocks of stone elaborately wrought, equaling, if not surpassing in size, any known to exist in Egypt or India. At Cuzco, 2 or more degrees north of Lake Titicaca, there are ruins of buildings that were occupied until the rule of the Incas was overthrown. Remains of the old structures are seen in various parts of the present town, some of them incorporated into new edifices built by the Spaniards. Cyclopean remains of walls of the Temple of the Sun now constitute a portion of the convent of Saint Domingo. In the days of the Incas, this temple stood a circuit of more than 400 paces. It was surrounded by a great wall built of cut stone. Remains of the old fortifications are seen, and there is an extensive ruin here which shows what is supposed to be all that remains of the palace of the Incas. Figures 56 and 57 give views of remains of the ancient fortress walls at Cuzco. Occasionally there is search at Cuzco by means of excavation for antiquities. Within a few years, an important discovery has been made. A lunar calendar of the Incas made of gold has been exhumed. At first, it was described as a gold breastplate or sun, but William Bulliert, who gives an account of it, finds that it is a calendar, the first discovered in Peru. Many others probably went to the melting pot at the time of the conquest. This is not quite circular. The outer ring is 5 inches and 3/10 in diameter, and the inner 4 inches. It was made to be fastened to the breast of an Inca or priest. The figures were stamped on it, and there seemed to be 24 compartments, large and small, including 3 at the top. And the bottom are 2 spaces. Figures may or may not have been there, but it looks as if they had been worn away. It was found about the year 1859. The uniform and constant report of Peruvian tradition places the beginning of this old civilization in the valley of Cuzco near Lake Titicaca. There appeared the first civilizers and the first civilized communities. This beautiful valley is the most elevated tableland on the continent, Lake Titicaca being 12,846 feet above the sea level. Were it not within the tropics, it would be a rain of eternal snow, for it is more than 4,000 feet higher than the beginning of perpetual snow on Mont Blanc. Near it are some of the higher peaks of the Andes, among them Cerrato, Illimani, and Sajama. Other ruins in Peru. The ancient Peru conquered and robbed by Pizarro is now divided into Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, as far down as the 37th degree of south latitude. Its remains are found to some extent in all these countries, although most abundantly in Peru. The ruins known as the palaces of Gran Chimu are situated in the northwestern part of Peru near Truxillo. Here, in the time of the first Incas, was an independent state, which was subjugated by the Inca set down in the list of Montesinos as the grandfather of Huayna Capic, about a century before the Spaniards arrived. For what is known of these ruins, we are chiefly indebted to Mariano Rivero, director of the National Museum at Lima. They cover a space of 3/4 of a league without, including the walled squares found on every side. The chief objects of interest are the remains of 2 great edifices called palaces. These palaces are immense areas surrounded by high walls of brick, the walls being now 10 or 12 yards high and 6 feet thick at the base. There was in each case another wall exterior to this. Within the palace walls were squares and dwellings, with narrow passages between them, and the walls are decorated. In the largest palace are the remains of a great reservoir for water, which was brought to it by subterranean aqueducts from the river Moche, 2 miles distant. Outside the enclosures of these palaces are remains of a vast number of buildings, which indicate that the city contained a great population. The Spaniards took vast quantities of gold from the huacas, or tombs, at this place. The amount taken from a single tomb in the year 1566 and 1592 was officially estimated at nearly $1 million. Figure 58 presents an end view of the walls at Gran Chimu. Figures 59 and 60 represent some of the decorations at Chimu Canchu. Remarkable ruins exist at Cuelap in northern Peru. They consist of a wall of wrought stones, 3,600 feet long, 560 broad, and 150 high, constituting a solid mass with a level summit. Probably the interior was made of earth. On this mass was another 600 feet long, 500 broad, and 150 high. In this, and also in the lower structure, there are many rooms made of wrought stone, in which are a great number of niches or cells 1 or 2 yards deep, which were used as tombs. Other old structures exist in that neighborhood. Farther south at Huánuco el Viejo, or Old Huánuco, are 2 peculiar edifices and a terrace, and near them are faded traces of a large town. The 2 edifices were built of a composition of pebbles and clay, faced with hewn stone. One of them is called the Lookout, but it is impossible to discover the purpose for which it was built. The interior of the other is crossed by 6 walls, in each of which is a gateway, the outer one being finely finished and showing a sculptured animal on each of the upper corners. It has a large court and rooms made of cut stones. Connected with this structure was a well-built aqueduct. Figure 61 and 62 gives views of the so-called palace and its ground plan. Figure 63 represents the lookout. 7 leagues from Lima, near the sea, are the much dilapidated ruins shown in Figure 64 of a large city of the Incas, which was built chiefly of adobes or sun-dried bricks. It is called Pachacamac. Ruins of towns, castles, fortresses, and other structures are found all about the country. At one place, near Chavin de Huanta, there are remarkable ruins which are very old. The material used here was like that seen in Old Huánuco. From the interior of one of the great buildings, there is a subterranean passage which, it is said, goes under the river to the opposite bank. Very ancient ruins showing remains of large and remarkable edifices were seen near Huamanga and described by Sieca de Leon. The native tradition said this city was built by bearded white men who came there long before the time of the Incas and established a settlement. It is noticed everywhere that the ancient Peruvians made large use of aqueducts, which they built with notable skill, using hewn stones and cement and making them very substantial. Some of them are still in use. They were used to carry water to the cities and to irrigate the cultivated lands. A few of them were very long. There is mention of one which was 150 miles long, and of another which was extended 450 miles across sierras and over rivers from south to north. The Great Peruvian Roads. Nothing in ancient Peru was more remarkable than the public roads. No ancient people has left traces of works more astonishing than these, so vast was their extent and so great the skill and labor required to construct them. One of these roads ran along the mountains through the whole length of the empire from Cui to Chile. Another, starting from this at Cuzco, went down to the coast and extended northward to the equator. These roads were built on beds or deep understructures of masonry. The width of the roadways varied from 20 to 25 feet, and they were made level and smooth by paving, and in some places by a sort of macadamizing with pulverized stone mixed with lime and bituminous cement. This cement was used in all the masonry. On each side of the roadway was a very strong wall made more than a fathom in thickness. These roads went over marshes, rivers, and great chasms of the Sierras, and through rocky precipices on mountainsides. The great road passing along the mountains was a marvelous work. In many places, its way was cut through rock for leagues. Great ravines were filled up with solid masonry. Rivers were crossed by means of a curious kind of suspension bridges, and no obstruction was encountered which the builders did not overcome. The builders of our Pacific Railroad, with their superior engineering skill and mechanical appliances, might reasonably shrink from the cost and the difficulties of such a work as this. Extending from 1 degree north of Quito to Cuzco, and from Cuzco to Chile, it was quite as long as the 2 Pacific Railroads, and its wild route among the mountains was far more difficult. Sarmiento, describing it, said, "It seems to me that if the Emperor, Charles V, should see fit to order the construction of another road like that which leads from Cui to Cuzco, or that which from Cuzco goes towards Chile, I certainly think he would not be able to make it with all his power." Humboldt examined some of the remains of this road and described as follows a portion of it seen in a pass of the Andes between Mansi and Loxa. Our eyes rested continually on superb remains of a paved road of the Incas. The roadway, paved with well-cut dark porphyrific stone, was 20 feet wide and rested on deep foundations. This road was marvelous. None of the Roman roads I have seen in Italy, in the south of France, or in Spain appear to me more imposing than this work of the ancient Peruvians. He saw remains of several other shorter roads which were built in the same way, some of them between Loxa and the river Amazon. Along these roads, at equal distances, were edifices, a kind of caravanserais built of hewn stone for the accommodation of travelers. These great works were described by every Spanish writer on Peru, and in some accounts of them we find suggestions in regard to their history. They are called roads of the Incas, but they were probably much older than the time of these rulers. The mountain road running towards Quito was much older than the Inca Huayna Capac, to whom it has sometimes been attributed. It is stated that when he started by this route to invade the Quitus, the road was so bad that he found great difficulties in the passage. It was then an old road, much out of repair, and he immediately ordered the necessary reconstructions. Gamarra says Huayna Capac restored, enlarged, and completed these roads, but he did not build them, as some pretend. These great artificial highways were broken up and made useless at the time of the conquest, and the subsequent barbarous rule of the Spaniards allowed them to go to decay. Now only broken remains of them exist to show their former character. The Peruvian civilization. The development of civilization in Peru was very different from that in Mexico and Central America. In both regions, the people were sun worshippers, but their religious organizations, as well as their methods of building temples, were unlike. Neither of these peoples seems to have borrowed from the other. It may be that all the old American civilizations had a common origin in South America, and that all the ancient Americas whose civilization can be traced in remains found north of the Isthmus came originally from that part of the continent. This hypothesis appears to me more probable than any other that I've heard suggested. But, assuming this to be true, the first migration of civilized people from South America must have taken place at a very distant period in the past, for it preceded not only the history indicated by the existing antiquities, but also an earlier history during which the Peruvians and Central Americas grew to be as different from their ancestors as from each other. In each case, the development of civilization represented by existing monuments, so far as we can study it, appears to have been original. In some respects, the Peruvian civilization was developed to such a degree as challenged admiration. The Peruvians were highly skilled in agriculture and in some kinds of manufactures. No people ever had a more efficient system of industry. This created their wealth and made possible their great public works. All accounts of the country at the time of the conquest agree in the statement that they cultivated the soil in a very admirable way and with remarkable success, using aqueducts for irrigation and employing guano as one of their most important fertilizers. Europeans learned from them the value of this fertilizer, and its name, guano, is Peruvian. The remains of their works show what they were as builders. Their skill in cutting stone and their wonderful masonry can be seen and admired by modern builders in what is left of their aqueducts, their roads, their temples, and their other great edifices. They had great proficiency in the art of spinning, weaving, and dyeing. For their cloth, they used cotton and wool of 4 varieties of the llama and of the vicuña, being the finest. Some of their cloth had interwoven designs and ornaments very skillfully executed. Many of their fabrics had rare excellence in the eyes of the Spaniards. Garcilaso says, "The coverings of the beds were blankets and frezes of the wool of the vicuña, which is so fine and so much prized that, among other precious things of that land, they have been brought for the bed of Don Philip II. Of their dyes, this account is given in the work of Rivero and von Tschudi. They possess the secret of fixing the dye of all colors, flesh color, yellow, gray, blue, green, black, etc., so firmly in the thread or in the cloth already woven that they never faded during the lapse of ages, even when exposed to air or buried in tombs underground. Only the cotton became slightly discolored, while woolen fabrics preserved their primitive luster. It is a circumstance worth remarking that chemical analyses made of pieces of cloth of all the different dyes prove that the Peruvians extracted all their colors from the vegetable and none from the mineral kingdom. In fact, the natives of the Peruvian mountains now use plants unknown to Europeans, producing from them bright and lasting colors. They had great skill in the art of working metals, especially gold and silver. Besides these precious metals, they had copper, tin, lead, and quicksilver. Figures 65 and 66 show some of the implements used by the Peruvians. Iron was unknown to them in the time of the Incas, although some maintain that they had it in the previous ages, to which belong the ruins at Lake Titicaca. Iron ore was and still is very abundant in Peru. It is impossible to conceive how the Peruvians were able to cut and work stone in such a masterly way, or to construct their great roads and aqueducts without the use of iron tools. Some of the languages of the country, and perhaps all, had names for iron. In official Peruvian, it was called quile, and in the old Chilean tongue, panilic. It is remarkable, observes Molina, that iron, which has been thought unknown to the ancient Americans, has particular names in some of their tongues. It is not easy to understand why they had names for this metal if they never at any time had knowledge of the metal itself. In the Mercurio Peruano, Tome 1, page 201, 1791, it is stated that, anciently, the Peruvian sovereigns worked magnificent iron mines at Ancriames, on the west shore of Lake Titicaca, but I cannot give the evidence used in support of this statement. Their goldsmiths and silversmiths had attained very great proficiency. They could melt the metals in furnaces, cast them in molds made of clay and gypsum, hammer their work with remarkable dexterity, inlay it, and solder it with great perfection. The gold and silver work of these artists was extremely abundant in the country at the time of the conquest, but Spanish greed had it all melted for coinage. It was with articles of this gold work that the Inca Atahualpa filled a room in his vain endeavor to purchase release from captivity. One of the old chroniclers mentions statuary, jars, vases, and every species of vessels, all of fine gold. Describing one of the palaces, he said, "They had an artificial garden, the soil of which was made of small pieces of fine gold, and this was artificially sowed with different kinds of maize which were of gold, their stems, leaves, and ears. Besides this, they had more than 20 sheep or llamas with their lambs, attended by sheep herds, all made of gold. This may be the same artificial garden which was mentioned by Francisco Lopez de Gomara, who places it on an island near Puna. Similar gardens of gold are mentioned by others. It is believed that a large quantity of Peruvian gold work was thrown into Lake Titicaca to keep it from the Spanish robbers. In a description of one lot of golden articles sent to Spain in 1534 by Pizarro, there is mention of 4 llamas, 10 statues of women of full size, and a cistern of gold so curious that it incited the wonder of all. Nothing is more constantly mentioned by the old Spanish chroniclers than the vast abundance of gold in Peru. It was more common than any other metal. Temples and palaces were covered with it, and it was very beautifully wrought into ornaments, temple furniture, articles for household use, and imitations of almost every object in nature. In the course of 25 years after the conquest, the Spaniards sent from Peru to Spain more than 400 million ducats, or $800 million, worth of gold, all or nearly all of it having been taken from the subjugated Peruvians as booty. Figures 67 and 68 show a golden and silver vase reduced from the actual size. Figures 69 and 70 represent various articles of pottery. All these illustrations are copies from articles taken from old Peruvian tombs. The most perfectly manufactured articles of Peruvian pottery were used in the tombs. Some of those made for other uses were very curious. A considerable number of articles made for common use have been preserved. Mariano Rivero, a Peruvian, says, "At this day, there exists in many houses pitchers, large jars, and earthen pots of this manufacture, which are preferred for their solidity to those manufactured by our own potters. The ancient Peruvians were inferior to the Central Americans in the arts of ornamentation and sculpture. Science among the Peruvians was not very highly developed, but engineering skill of some kind is indicated by the great roads and aqueducts. Their knowledge of the art of preparing colors and certain useful medicines implied a study of plants. Their progress in astronomy was not equal to that found in Central America. Nevertheless, they had an accurate measure of the solar year, but unlike the Central Americans, they divided the year into 12 months, and they used mechanical contrivances successfully to fix the times of the solstices and equinoxes. A class of men called Emautas was trained to preserve and teach whatever knowledge existed in the country. It was their business to understand the quipas, keep in memory the historical poems, give attention to the science and practice of medicine, and train their pupils in knowledge. These were not priests, they were the learned men of Peru, and the government allowed them every facility for study and for communicating instruction. How much they knew of astronomy is not easy to say. They had knowledge of some of the planets, and it is claimed that there is some reason to believe they used aids to eyesight in studying the heavens, such as some suppose were used by our mound builders. A discovery made in Bolivia a few years since is cited in support of this belief. It is the figure of a man in the act of using a tube to aid vision, which was taken from an ancient tomb. Mr. David Forbes, an English chemist and geologist, obtained it in Bolivia and carried it to England in 1864. William Bellert describes it as follows in a paper read to the London Anthropological Society. It is a nude figure of silver 2.5 inches in height on a flat pointed pedestal. In the right hand, it has the mask of a human face, but in the left a tube over 1/2 inch in height, the narrow part placed to the left eye in a diagonal position as if observing some celestial object. This is the first specimen of a figure in the act of looking through a hollow tube directed to the heavens that has been found in the New World. we cannot suppose the Peruvians had anything that more nearly resembled a telescope. It was found in a chulpa, or ancient Indian tomb, at Quequingora, near Corocoro, latitude 17 degrees 15 south and longitude 68 degrees 35 west, in Bolivia. He forgets the astronomical monument described by Captain Dupaix. The art of writing in alphabetical characters, so far as appears, was unknown to the Peruvians in the time of the Incas. No Peruvian books existed at that time, and no inscriptions have been found in any of the ruins. They had a method of recording events, keeping accounts, and making reports to the government by means of the quipu. This was made of cords of twisted wool, fastened to a base prepared for the purpose. These cords were of various sizes and colors, and every size and color had its meaning. The record was made by means of an elaborate system of knots and artificial intertwinings. The amautas were carefully educated to the business of understanding and using the quipus, and this science was so much perfected that those skilled in it attained the art of recording historical events, laws, and decrees so as to transmit to their descendants the most striking events of the empire. Thus, the quipus could supply the place of documents. Each quipu was a book full of information for those who could read it. Among the amutas, memory was educated to retain and transmit to posterity songs, historical narratives, and long historical poems. It is said also that tragedies and comedies were composed and preserved in this way, and that dramatic performances were among the regular entertainments encouraged and supported by the Incas. Whether the art of writing ever existed in the country cannot now be determined. Some of the Peruvian tongues had names for paper. The people knew that a kind of paper or parchment could be made of plantain leaves, and according to Montesinos, writing in books were common in the older times, that is to say, in ages long previous to the Incas. He explains how the art was lost, as I shall presently show. It is not improbable that a kind of hieroglyphical writing existed in some of the Peruvian communities, especially among the Aymares. Humboldt mentions books of hieroglyphical writing found among the Panos on the river Ucayali, which were bundles of their paper resembling our volumes in quarto. A Franciscan missionary found an old man sitting at the foot of a palm tree and reading one of these books to several young persons. The Franciscan was told that the writing contained hidden things which no stranger ought to know. It was seen that the pages of the book were covered with figures of men, animals, and isolated characters deemed hieroglyphical and arranged in lines with order and symmetry. The Panos said these books were transmitted to them by their ancestors and had relation to wanderings and ancient wars. There is similar writing on a prepared llama skin found among other antiquities on a peninsula in Lake Titicaca, which is now in the museum at La Paz, Bolivia. It appears to be a record of atrocities perpetrated by the Spaniards at the time of the conquest and shows that some of the Aymares could at that time write hieroglyphics. 11. Peruvian Ancient History. The Peruvians, like most other important peoples in all ages, had mythical wonder stories instead of authentic ancient history to explain the origin of their nation. These were told in traditions and legends preserved and transmitted from generation to generation by the amautas. If they were also recorded in secret books of hieroglyphical writing, such as those found among the Panos on the Ucayali, which contained hidden things that no stranger ought to know, satisfactory evidence of the fact has never been brought to light. In addition to these, they had many historical traditions of much more importance, relating in long poems and preserved in the same way, and there were annals and national documents recorded in the quipus. Some of the Spanish writers on Peru who described what they saw in the country at the time of the conquest discussed its history. If they had used the proper sources of information with a more penetrating and complete investigation and studied the subject as it might have been studied at the time, their historical sketches would now have great value. The two most important works written at this time, the Relación of Sarmiento and the Relaciones of Polo de Ondegardo, were never printed. But none of these writers sought to study Peruvian antiquity beyond the period of the Incas, although some of them, Acosta, for instance, inquired sufficiently to see that Manco Cápac was a mythical personage prefixed to the dynastic line of the Incas without actually belonging to it. This limited view of the ancient history, which was inconsistent with what could be seen in the antiquities and traditions of the country, was generally accepted because nothing more could be known in Europe, and its influence was established by the undue importance accorded to the Comentarios Reales of Garcilaso de la Vega, published in 1609. Garcilaso's history. Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of a distinguished Spaniard of the same name, was born at Cusco in 1540. His mother, named Ñusta, was a niece of the great Inca Huayna Cápac and granddaughter of his no less eminent predecessor, Tupac Yupanqui. The intimate blood relationship which connected him with the Incas naturally drew attention to his work and, with more haste than reason, was treated as the best possible qualification for writing Peruvian history. Therefore, his Comentarios acquired a very great celebrity and came to be regarded as the highest authority on all questions relating to Peru previous to the conquest. The work never deserved this reputation, although it was not without value as an addition to what had been written on the subject by the Spaniards. Garcilaso was not well qualified to write a faithful history of Peru, either by his knowledge or by the temper of his mind. His aim was to glorify the Incas and their times, and much of his work was in the strain of tales heard in childhood from his mother. The Comentarios Reales were written just as their author's training had prepared him to write them. He lived in Cusco without education until he was nearly 20 years old, his intellectual development being confined to the instruction necessary to make him a good Catholic. He then went to Spain and never returned to Peru. The next period of his life was devoted to seeking distinction in the Spanish military service, but political influence was against him, and he could not attain the object of his ambition. He finally retired to Cordova, acquired some literary culture, and resolved to win distinction by writing a history of his native country. His materials for such a history, in addition to what could be learned from the earlier Spanish writers, consisted entirely of what he had learned of his mother and his early Peruvian associates at Cusco, and of such acquisitions as could be gained by means of correspondence with his acquaintances in Peru after the purpose to write a history was formed. It can be seen readily that Garcilaso's history written in this way might have a certain value, while it could not be safely accepted as an authority. The first part of his work was published in 1609 when he was nearly 70 years old. According to his version of the Peruvian annals, the rule of the Incas began with the mythical Manco Cápac and lasted over 500 years, and this version, with some variations and estimates of time, has been repeated ever since. The dynastic line of the Incas thus determined is given in the work of Rivero and Vanchuti as follows. 1. Manco Cápac, mysterious son of the sun, who began to reign in 1021 AD and died in 1062, having reigned 40 years. 2. Sinchi Roca, who reigned 30 years from 1062 to 1091. 3. Loque Yupanqui, reigned 35 years from 1091 to 1126. 4. Mayta Cápac, 30 years from 1126 to 1156. 5. Cápac Yupanqui, 41 years, from 1156 to 1197. 6. Inca Roca, 51 years, from 1197 to 1249. 7. Yahuacapic, 40 years, from 1249 to 1289. 8. Viracocha, 51 years, from 1289 to 1340. His son, Inca Urco, reigned after him 11 days, and was then deposed as a fool incapable of governing. 9. Titu Manco Capic Pacha Hutek, 60 years, from 1340 to 1400. Living, says tradition, to be 103 years old. 10. Yupanqui, 39 years, from 1400 to 1439. 11. Tupac Yapanqui, Garcilaso's great-grandfather, 36 years, from 1439 to 1475. 12. Huayna Capic, the most glorious of the Incas, 50 years, from 1475 to 1525. After his death, the empire was divided between his two sons, Huascar and Atahualpa. This caused a civil war, which ended with the death of Huascar in 1532. 1 year later, Atahualpa was himself destroyed by Cortez. Manco Capic, here set down as the first Inca, with a marvelous story of his mysterious origin and his miraculous powers as a civilizer, was undoubtedly borrowed from traditions of the origin of civilization in the more ancient times, which had been used by the Incas in support of their claim to direct descent from the sun. In reality, the first Inca was Roca, or Sinchi Roca, and several of the early Spanish writers were sufficiently well informed to see this. The period of the Incas must have been less than 500 years if their dynasty consisted of no more than 12 or 13 sovereigns. In other respects, this table of the sovereigns may be substantially correct, for there is a general agreement in regard to the names and the order of succession, although Montesinos maintains that the fifth Inca on the list was borrowed by Garcilaso from traditions of a much more ancient sovereign who was greatly celebrated in the historical poems, or confounded with him. The period of the Incas was very distinct in Peruvian history, but it is now understood that they represent only the last period in the history of a civilization which began much farther back in the past. Fernando Montesinos, the only Spanish writer who really studied the ancient history of Peru in the traditional and the other records of the country, was Fernando Montesinos, who went there about a century after the conquest. He was sent from Spain on service, which took him to every part of Peru and gave him the best possible opportunities for investigation. He was a scholar and a worker with a strong inclination to such studies, and during 2 periods of residence in the country, he devoted 15 years to these inquiries with unremitting industry and great success. He soon learned to communicate freely with the Peruvians in their own language. Then he applied himself to collect the historical poems, narratives, and traditions. He succeeded in getting assistance from many of the older men who had learned of the Amautas, and especially of those who were trained to read the Quipus. Nothing was omitted which could aid his purpose. In this way, Montesinos made a great collection of what may be called the old Peruvian documents and gained a vast amount of information which no other writer had used or even sought to acquire. The materials collected were more important than is at once understood by those accustomed to depend wholly on writing and printing for the preservation of literature, because they cannot easily realize to what extent the faculty of memory may be sharpened and developed by a class of men devoted to this culture in communities where such mechanical aids do not exist. It is known that long poems, stories, and historical narratives have been preserved by unlettered peoples much below the civilized condition of the Peruvians. Long poems extending to 300 and 400 lines were retained by memory and transmitted from generation to generation among the Sandwich Islanders. Many scholars have believed that all of the early literature of Greece, including the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all other poems of the cycle, was preserved in this way by the Rhapsodists for centuries down to the time of Pisistratus, and then, for the first time, reduced to writing. This shows at least what they have believed was possible. In Max Muller's History of Ancient Sanskrit Literature, it is argued strongly that the Vedas were not written at first, but were transmitted orally, being learned by heart in the great religious schools of the Indo-Aryans as an indispensable part of education. This is likely to be true, whether we assume that the Indo-Aryans had or had not the art of writing, for in the Vedic age, the divine songs of the Veda were so intimately associated with the mysteries of their religion that they may have been held too sacred to be made common by written characters. Therefore, it is in no wise incredible nor even surprising that a considerable amount of literature existed in Peru without the aid of writing. On the contrary, it would be surprising if they had failed to do what has been done by every other people in like circumstances. The schools of the Amautas were national institutes, specially set apart for the business of preserving and increasing knowledge, teaching, and literary work of every kind. In a country where civilization was so much advanced in many respects, they could not have been entirely barren. Those who criticize Montesinos admit that his advantages were great, that no one equaled him in archaeological knowledge of Peru, and that he became acquainted with original instruments which he occasionally transferred to his own pages, and which it would now be difficult to meet elsewhere. The results of his investigation are embodied in a work entitled Memorias Antiguas Historiales del Peru. This, with another work on the conquest entitled Annales, remained in manuscript at Madrid until the Memorias was translated into French by M. Tourneau Compans and printed in his collection of original documents relating to the discovery and exploration of America. His scheme of Peruvian history. According to Montesinos, there were three distinct periods in the history of Peru. First, there was a period which began with the origin of civilization and lasted until the 1st or 2nd century of the Christian era. Second, there was a period of disintegration, decline, and disorder introduced by successful invasions from the east and southwest, during which the country was broken up into small states, and many of the arts of civilization were lost. This period lasted more than 1,000 years. Third and last came the period of the Incas, who revived civilization and restored the empire. He discards the wonder stories told of Manco Capac and Mama Oello, and gives the Peruvian nation a beginning which is, at least, not incredible. It was originated, he says, by a people led by 4 brothers who settled in the valley of Cusco and developed civilization there in a very human way. The youngest of these brothers assumed supreme authority and became the first of a long line of sovereigns. Montesinos gives a list of 64 sovereigns who reigned in the first period. The first was Puaha Manco and or Ayar Uchu Topa, the youngest of the 4 brothers, whose power was increased by the willing submission of neighboring nations. His successor, called Manco Capac, is described as a remarkable character. Adjacent nations dreaded his power, and in the time the kingdom was much increased. Next came Huanevi Pichua, and during his reign was known the use of letters, and the Amuatas taught astrology and the art of writing on leaves of the plantain tree. Sinchi Cosqui won victories and adorned and fortified the city of Cusco. Inti Capac Yupanqui, another remarkable character, divided the kingdom into districts and sub-districts, introduced a complete civil organization, instituted the solar year of 365 days, and established the system of couriers. Manco Capac II made great roads from Cusco to the provinces. These are the first 6 rulers named on the list. In the next 13 reigns, nothing special is noted save attention to civil affairs, occasional conquests, and a great plague. The 20th sovereign, called Huascar to Tupac, gave all the provinces new governors of royal blood, and introduced in the army a cuirass made of cotton and copper. The 21st Manco Capac Amauta, being addicted to astronomy, convened a scientific council which agreed that the sun was at a greater distance from the earth than the moon, and that they followed different courses. In the next 12 reigns, wars, conquests, and some indications of religious controversy are noted. The 34th ruler, called Ayay Manco, assembled the Amautas in Cuzco to reform the calendar, and it was decided that the year should be divided into months of 30 days and weeks of 10 days, calling the 5 days at the end of the year a small week. They also collected the years into decades or groups of tens and determined that each group of 10 decades should form a sun. Among the next 29 sovereigns, Capac Remy Amauta, the 38th of the line, and Yahuar Huquiz, the 51st, were celebrated for astronomical knowledge, and the latter intercalated a year at the end of 4 centuries. Manco Capac III, the 16th sovereign in this line, is supposed to have reigned at the beginning of the Christian era, and in his time Peru had reached her greatest elevation and extension. The next 3 reigns covered 32 years, it is said. Then came Titu Yupanqui Pachacuti, the 64th and last sovereign of the Old Kingdom, who was killed in battle with a horde of invaders who came from the east and southeast across the Andes. His death threw the kingdom into confusion. There was rebellion as well as invasion, by which it was broken up into small states. The account of what happened says, many ambitious ones, taking advantage of the new king's youth, denied him obedience, drew away from him and the people, and usurped several provinces. Those who remained faithful to their heir of Titu Yupanqui conducted him to Tambotoco, whose inhabitants offered him obedience. From this it happened that this monarch took the title of King of Tambotoco. During the next 26 reigns, the sway of the old royal house was confined to this little state. These 26 successors of the old sovereign were merely kings of Tambotoco. The country, overrun by rude invaders, torn by civil war, and harried by many simultaneous tyrants, became semi-barbarous. All was found in great confusion. Life and personal safety were endangered, and civil disturbances caused an entire loss of the use of letters. The art of writing seems to have been mixed up with the issues of a religious controversy in the time of the Old Kingdom. It was prescribed now, even in the little state of Tambotoco, for we read that the 14th of its 26 rulers prohibited under the severest penalty the use of cuelca for writing, and forbade also the invention of letters. Cuelca was a kind of parchment made of plantain leaves. It is added that Amauta, who sought to restore the art of writing, was put to death. This period of decline, disorder, and disintegration, which covered the dark ages of Peru, lasted until the rise of the Incas brought better times and reunited the country. Roca, called Inca Roca, was the first of the Incas. He was connected with the old royal family, but did not stand in the direct line of succession. The story of his rise to power is told as follows. A princess of royal blood, named Mama Siboca, contrived by artifice and intrigue to raise to the throne her son called Roca, a youth of 20 years, and so handsome and valiant that his admirers called him Inca, which means Lord. This title of Inca began with him, and was adopted by all his successors. He appears to have had great qualities as a ruler. Not much time passed before he secured possession of Cuzco, made war successfully against the neighboring princes, and greatly extended his dominions. Under his successors, the empire thus begun continued to grow until it was extended from Quito to Chile and became the Peruvian Empire, which the Spaniards robbed and destroyed. Probabilities. It has been the fashion to depreciate Montesinos, but I find it impossible to discover the reasons by which this depreciation can be justified. It is alleged that he uses fanciful hypotheses to explain Peru. The reply to this seems to me conclusive. In the first place, he is, in this respect, like all other writers of his time. That was an age of fanciful theories. Montesinos is certainly no worse than the others in this respect, while he has the merit of being somewhat more original. He brought the Peruvian civilization from Armenia and argued that Peru was Solomon's Ophir. Undue importance has been accorded to several of the old Spanish chroniclers whose works contain suggestions and fancies much more irrational. In the second place, his theories have nothing whatever to do with his facts, by which they are sometimes contradicted. He found in Peru materials for the scheme of its ancient history, which he sets forth. Readers will form their own estimates of its value, but no reasonable critic will confound this part of his work with his fanciful explanations, which are sometimes inconsistent with it. For instance, his theory assumes that the first monarch of the Old Kingdom began his reign as far back in the past as the year 2500 BC, but he reports only 64 rulers of that Old Kingdom. Now, if there were so many as 64, and if we allow an average of 20 years to each reign, which is sufficient, we cannot carry back the beginning of that first reign to the year 1200 BC. There is another objection, which must have stated in the words of one of the critics who have urged it, Montesinos treats the ancient history of Peru in a mode so original and distinct from all others that we can perceive it to be a production alike novel and unknown. If this means anything, it means that it was highly improper for Montesinos to find in Peru what was unknown to poorly informed and superficial Spanish writers who had already been accepted as authorities, in quotes. It would have been singular if his careful investigation continued through 15 years had not given him a great amount of information which others had never taken pains to acquire. His treatment of the subject was original and distinct from all others because he knew what other writers did not know. His information did not allow him to repeat the marvelous story of Manco Capac and Mama Oello, nor to confine Peruvian history to the time of the Incas. But when the result of his inquiries was announced in Europe, Garcilaso and others regulated the fashion of Peruvian studies, and the influence of their limited and superficial knowledge of the subject has been felt ever since. The curious theories of Montesinos may be brushed aside as rubbish, or be studied with other vagaries of that age in order to understand its difference from ours. But whoever undertakes to criticize his facts needs to be his equal in knowledge of Peru. His works, however, tell us all that can ever be known of Peruvian ancient history, for the fallacies for investigation which existed in his time are no longer possible. It may, however, be useful to consider that the main fact in his report on the subject is no more original and distinct than the testimony of the monuments around Lake Titicaca. The significance of this testimony is now generally admitted. There was a period in the history of Peruvian civilization much earlier than that of the Incas, a period still represented by those old monuments which, so far as relates to this point, are as novel and original as Montesinos himself. That the civilization found in the country was much more old than the Incas can be seen in what we know of their history. Their empire had grown to be what Pizarro found it by subjugating and absorbing a considerable number of small states which had existed as civilized states before their time. The conquest of Quito, which was not inferior to the valley of Cusco in civilization, had just been completed when the Spaniards arrived. The Chimus, subjugated a few years earlier, are described as even more advanced in civilization than any other Peruvian community. The small states thus absorbed by Peru were much alike in manners, customs, manufactures, methods of building, and general culture. It is manifest that their civilization had a common origin, and that to find its origin we must go back into the past far beyond Inca Rocco, the first in his line, who began the work of uniting them under one government. Moreover, there were civilized communities in that part of the continent which the Incas had not subjugated, such as the Muiscas on the tableland of Bogota north of Quito, who had a remarkable civil and religious organization, a temple of the sun built with stone columns, a regular system of computing time, a peculiar calendar, and who used small circular gold plates as coin. They were described by Humboldt. The condition of the people composing the Peruvian Empire at the time of the conquest bore witness to an ancient history something like that reported by Montesinos. There were indications that the country had undergone important revolutionary changes before this empire was established. The Peruvians at the time were not all one people. The political union was complete, but there were differences of speech and to some extent of physical characteristics. Three numerous and important branches of the population were known as Aymares, Chinchas, and Huancas. They used different tongues, although the Quichua dialect spoken by the Incas, and doubtless a dialect of the Aymares, to whom the Incas belonged, was the official language in every part of the empire. There was a separated and fragmentary condition of the communities with respect to their unlike characteristics, which implied something different from a quiet and uniform political history. These differences and peculiarities suggest that there was a period when Peru, after an important career of civilization and empire, was subjected to great political changes brought about by invasion and revolution, by which the nation was for a long time broken up into separate states. Here, as in Mexico and Central America, there was in the traditions frequent mention of strangers or foreigners who came by sea to the Pacific coast and held intercourse with the people, but this was in the time of the Old Kingdom. As the Malays and other island people under their influence formerly traversed the Pacific, this is not improbable. Some have assumed that the Peruvians had no communication with the Mexicans and Central Americans, and that the two peoples were unknown to each other. This, however, seems to be contradicted by the fact that an accurate knowledge of Peru was found among the people inhabiting the Isthmus and the region north of it. The Spaniards heard of Peru on the Atlantic coast of South America, but on the Isthmus, Balboa gained clear information in regard to that country from natives who had eventually seen it. To what extent there was intercourse between the two civilized portions of the continent is unknown. They had vessels quite as good as most of those constructed at Panama by the Spanish hunters for Peru, such as the balsas of the Peruvians and the shallop of the Mayas, seen by Columbus, which made communication possible up and down the coast, but whether regular intercourse between them was ever established and everything else relating to this matter must necessarily be left to a calculation of probabilities. Conclusion. If, as seems most likely, there was in South America an ancient development of civilized human life, out of which arose the civilizations found in Peru and Central America, its antiquity was much greater than can be comprehended by the current chronologies. This, however, cannot make it improbable, for these chronologies are really no more reasonable than the monkish fantasies used in the 16th and 17th centuries to explain these civilizations. We find the hagiologists very absurd, but the condition in mind which made them possible is closely akin to that which moves some of our men in our time to deny or limit the past and reject the results of any investigation which tend to enlarge it. Rational inquiry constantly forces upon us the suggestion that there was more in the unwritten history of the human race than our inherited modes of thinking have allowed us to suppose, and that the beginning of civilization is far more ancient than our long accepted theories of inquiry are able to admit. What may be discovered in South America by a more complete geological and paleontological investigation, it is now not possible to say. Professor Orton, in his recent book, The Andes and the Amazon, far exceeds Montesinos in his estimate of the antiquity of Peruvian civilization. He says on this point, geology and archaeology are combining to prove that Cerrato and Chimborazo have looked down upon a civilization far more ancient than that of the Incas, and perhaps coeval with the flint flakes of Cornwall and the shell mounds of Denmark. On the shores of Lake Titicaca are extensive ruins which antedate the event of Manco Capac and may be as venerable as the lake dwellings of Geneva. Wilson has traced 6 terraces in going up from the sea through the province of Esmeraldas towards Quito, and underneath the living forest which is older than the Spanish invasion, many gold, copper, and stone vestiges of a lost population were found. In all these cases, these relics are situated below the high tide mark in a bed of marine sediment, from which he infers that this part of the country formerly stood higher above the sea. If this be true, vast must be the antiquity of these remains, for the upheaval and subsidence of the coast is exceedingly slow. Page 109. This refers to discoveries made on the coast of Ecuador in 1860 by James S. Wilson, Esquire. At various points along this coast he found ancient or fossil pottery, vessels, images, and other manufactured articles, all finely wrought. Some of these articles were made of gold. The most remarkable fact connected with them is that they were taken from a stratum of ancient surface earth, which was covered with a marine deposit 6 feet thick. The geological formation where these remains were found is reported to be as old as the drift strata of Europe and identical with that at Guayaquil, in which bones of the mastodon are met with. The ancient surface of the earth or vegetable mold with its pottery, gold work, and other relics of civilized human life was therefore below the sea when the marine deposit was spread over it. This land, after being occupied by men, has subsided and settled below the ocean, remained there long enough to accumulate the marine deposit, and again been elevated to its former position above the sea level. Since this elevation, forests have been established over it which are older than the Spanish conquest, and now it is once more subsiding. In 1862, at a meeting of the Royal Geological Society, Sir Roderick Murchison spoke of these discoveries as follows. The discoveries Mr. Wilson has made of the existence of the works of man in a stratum of mold beneath the sea level, and covered by several feet of clay, the phenomenon being persistent for 60 miles, are of the highest interest to physical geographers and geologists. The facts seem to demonstrate that, within the human period, the lands on the west coast of equatorial America were depressed and submerged, and that after the accumulation of marine clays above the terrestrial relics, the whole coast was elevated to its present position. Assuming the facts to be as Mr. Wilson reports, and they have not been called in question, it follows that there was a human civilization to a certain extent in South America at the time of the older Stone Age of Western Europe. The oldest Peruvian date of Montesinos is quite modern compared to this. The fact may be considered in connection with another mentioned in the section on American ethnology, namely, that of the most ancient fauna on this continent, man probably included, is that of South America. But without regard to what may be signified by these discoveries of Mr. Wilson, there is good reason for believing that the Peruvian civilization was much more ancient than it has been the fashion to admit. Peru would now be a very different country if the Spaniards had been sufficiently controlled by Christianity and civilization to treat the Peruvians justly and seek nothing more than friendly intercourse with them. But they went there as greedy buccaneers, unscrupulous robbers, and brought everything to ruin. At no time since the Spanish conquest has the country been as orderly, as prosperous, or as populous as they found it. It has fallen to a much lower condition, Industry and thrift have been supplanted by laziness and beggarly poverty. Ignorance and incapacity have taken the place of that intelligence and enterprise which enabled the old Peruvians to maintain their remarkable system of agriculture, complete their great works, and made them so industrious and skillful in their manufactures. The region covered by the Peruvian Empire has not half as many people now as it had in the time of the Incas. Is it possible to imagine the present inhabitants of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia cultivating their soil with intelligent industry, building aqueducts 500 miles long, and constructing magnificently paved roads through the rocks and across the ravines of the Andes from Quito to Chile? One of the scholars connected with the scientific expedition which visited South America in 1867, describing the ancient greatness and present inferior condition of Quito, explains, "May the future bring it days equal to those when it was called the city of the Incas." He might appropriately utter a similar wish for the whole country.